This episode covers some more of the odd jobs that happen between the big projects on our earth-sheltered home build. Specifically, framing a wood roof section, taking down the vault forms, pulling electrical through the smurf tubes, and setting up some pipes for underground temperature sensors, all in the first half of December. This first chunk of work, no pun intended, was to clear out the gunite that had filled the chimney form. Anyway, the lighting isn't great, but you can see that there was a lot of overhead hammer drilling and chisel work on a 13-foot ladder. The stills might be easier to understand. This is the view from the top looking down on the chimney from the concrete roof. I was really kicking myself for not putting something over the hole in the top of the form. 5 minutes work would have saved all this trouble. I had thought that simply telling the gunner to shoot around it would be sufficient, but for some reason it got filled up anyway. I drilled and chipped away at the edges of the block to try and separate the middle from the sides. It was fairly unpleasant working from below, but having the chips and dust fall away with gravity was sort of helpful, even if they were falling on me. The alternative, working on the slippery frozen roof in December, didn't seem any better. At the top of the chunk it was only about 6 inches thick, but at the bottom it was closer to 18 inches thick, which is the length of my longest drill bit. I also had to make sure to avoid the rebar and other bits of junk that were embedded in there. Anyway, after I'd separated the chunk, and I just needed to cut the rebar to make it fall. I didn't weigh the final chunk, but it was pretty big and heavy, and it hit the floor very hard when it dropped. Once the chunk was out of the way, I was left with the formwork that I was expecting to deal with initially. This just took a little bit more effort to pry out of the way. And that left me with a nice clean hole ready to install my chimney box in. But for now, I just covered it in plastic. We still had some other holes in the roof that shouldn't be there. This little section here needed a conventional roof. Well, maybe conventional isn't the right way to describe anything in this curvy project. This section required all custom trusses, and each one needed to be built and placed individually to produce that smooth overhang that was all at the same level. As usual, I work with jigs a lot, and you can see Sherry's holding a jig that ensures the overhang is consistent around that curve. And then she keeps herself busy to stay warm while I make all the compound cuts required for a good fit. And yes, every single one required a compound cut. In the end, the wood frame looked like this. And then I covered it in plywood and roofing underlayment, but that footage was all lost. We still had 2 vaults remaining that needed their formwork stripped. If you didn't see the videos where we set up these vaults or shot the gunite over them to form the concrete ceiling, I'll put those cards up in the top corner. They're some of the more interesting ones. In the winter, Sherry could often get out to the build after school while I was still at work, so it was some sort of overlapping shift situation. Here, she's taking the first shift and removing all the screws from the boards, at least all the ones that are applied from below. The 2x2 furring strips don't fall down right away because they're also held in place by lath screws placed from above. The 1x3 stiffeners do come down, and then Michael's stacking them for his treehouse. A bit before sunset, I arrive for that overlap shift and start pulling down the furring strips. We can't actually get to the screws with a driver, but we can just pry them so they tear through the hardy board. The sun sets just after 5 this time of year, and then it gets too cold for the kids. So Sherry takes them home, and they can do their homework, get ready for school. I'm keeping pretty warm, so I usually get out the lights, and then I just keep going for a couple more hours. Eventually we'll have some nice arch windows at the tops of those vaults. But for now, I just need to keep the cold wind out and probably some blowing snow, so I'm putting up some plastic. Once all the furring strips are out, the hardy board still needs a little persuasion to pull it down. Then I clean up the vault a little bit more by knocking off excess concrete and snipping the tie wires. Overall, this whole house has somewhat of organic shape, with nothing being quite smooth or flat, and you can see little ripples in the ceiling. But this one big concrete bulge on the right was just too much to let go, so I got out the hammer drill to sort it out. That's it, Vault 9 stripped and ready for stucco. Another afternoon and we are on the last vault. This is the kitchen vault. As often happens, Sherry had got there ahead of me and had already taken out the screws and cut all the wires off camera. And then as I'm pulling stuff down, Sherry and the boys are carting it away. Some for the reuse pile, some for the burn pile, and some for the treehouse. I love it when it comes down in a big section like that, but then it does still need to be torn up on the floor before it can be removed. Like all the previous vaults, I also put in the plastic to keep the weather out and tried to clean up the rough concrete as much as possible in prep for the stucco work. Another afternoon and we are back for some fun pulling wires for that rough electrical. The plan is to have lights that run along the tops of each of those ribs, and then also some ceiling lights. And here we're pulling the power wires for those through that smurf tube conduit that we put in the walls and ceilings before the concrete was even poured. Now we're trying to run the wires for those main lights. Some worked out, but others were blocked, and we couldn't figure out how to get the fish line through, so we just moved on for now. The yellow line that we're using is a wire fishing line. You feed it into the tubes, and then you tie the wires to the other end, and then you pull the wires back through. Like with most things with this house, this whole process is just so much easier if you have two people. In this case, one pulls, and one has to feed the wires in. So later I got back to those block tubes, and found that several of the smurf tubes must have been stepped on or something by the gunite crew when they were climbing around and doing the chute. The tubes ended up being snapped under the concrete, and so they were blocked by the concrete. I figured out where the breaks happened by a mixture of photos of the layout and measuring how far that fish line could go from each side until it got blocked. And then I drilled where I guessed the problem was until I found something. Then I would drill bigger holes and then chisel the concrete open until I could find both ends of the blue pipe. You can see I found this one on the third guess. Only 2 missed drill holes. I had picked these 2 spots first because the tube had originally been attached to that black bar, but I guess when it broke, it moved away. At least the 2 tubes were still aligned, so it was a pretty easy fix. No photo of that, but I had ended up putting a 3-inch long piece of smurf tube in there, and then I grouted over it, and then I was able to pull through the wire. This break here is frustratingly close to that final electrical box. You almost made it. And you can see some other wires that we're able to pull into this box. So you can imagine when we were setting this all up, we were able to avoid stepping on the blue because we could see the rebar and the blue and all that stuff when we were walking around up there. But once the gunite crew showed up and they covered this in 4 or 6 inches of gunite, they're stomping around up there in boots thinking they're walking on rebar, trying to stay safe, and it's easy to imagine how they could have stepped on a blue, and if it wasn't well supported, end up putting their whole weight on a little piece of plastic tube and that could snap. So that must be what happened. Next, I went down to the basement to hook up some lights down in that quad deck ceiling. I had earlier placed ENT conduit, that's the smurf tube again, in these when we'd poured the floor above. So now I just needed to saw open a little hole in the polystyrene and then run the wires through the smurf tube to the next from light to light to light in serial. These lights were to be controlled by a pair of 3-way switches, and one of them was at the top of the stairs. But I'd forgot to put conduit from that switch going up to the ceiling light. So, lots of things are happening on these crazy shotcrete days, and I just had somehow forgotten to plan that. So I had to dig a channel from the box all the way up to that smurf tube up in the corner of the ceiling. I ended up stuccoing over this ugliness after running the wires. The next step, the next video too, is going to be prepping to put in the floors, and this whole area is going to get covered. So this is my last chance to get some temperature sensors under this living room floor. I used a 10-foot gas line pipe to drill the holes, and then I dropped 3 tubes in each hole. One at the 10-foot depth, one at 5 foot, and one at 2.5 foot. At this point, Sherry was available, so we quickly pulled a few more wires through. Back to the drilling with a pipe. If you ever have to drill this way, don't pound it all the way in at once. You can, but don't. Go a foot or 2 and then pull it out, dump out the core dirt. If you do too much at once, it'll go in, but it's much more likely to get stuck and you might not be able to get it out. The gas line did get stuck at this last pull right here, so I got a ratchet strap and a ladder and I cranked to pull it out again. Then we bury it all and tidy up and focus on the next project, which is prepping and pouring a concrete floor over this whole area. If you made it this far, please like and subscribe. It feeds the algorithm and gets this shared with more people. Comments also help us out with the algorithm. And hit that notification bell if you want to know when the next video is ready.